He was a titan, a king in a glass castle overlooking Silicon Valley, but all his billions, all his power, couldn't buy back a single goddamn word. After chewing through 7 nannies in a single desperate month, Julian Croft was on the verge of shattering. His 6-year-old son, Leo, lived in a fortress of silence, a prisoner of a world no one could enter since the day he lost his mother. This tech mogul was ready to burn his empire to the ground, to give it all up, until a ghost of a housekeeper, a woman haunted by her own ravaged past, did what no high-priced therapist ever could. And what happened next didn't just break him, it fucking obliterated him. Before we dive into this absolute gut punch of a story, do me a solid and smash that subscribe button and obliterate the like button. And hey, drop a comment down below and tell me where in the world you're watching from. I want to know who's on this ride with me. Julian Croft had built a digital empire from his garage, a sprawling tech conglomerate that shaped the very way people communicated. He had everything. Private jets, sprawling estates, a name that commanded respect in any boardroom on the planet. But it was all just static, meaningless noise. The second he stepped inside his Palo Alto mansion and looked at his son, Leo. Since the day his wife, Clara, had been stolen from them by a sickness that even his money couldn't cure, Leo hadn't spoken. Not a word. Julian could still feel the phantom echo of the boy's laughter in the cavernous hallways, the memory of his small voice calling him Daddy. It all vanished the day they put his mother in the ground. Leo didn't just go quiet. He ceased to exist on their shared plane of reality. He didn't answer to his name. He didn't meet anyone's gaze. His eyes would look past you, through you, as if you were made of smoke. The so-called experts, the best money could buy, threw a label at him: severe non-verbal autism. Julian, a man who dealt in the concrete logic of code and data, didn't understand the diagnosis at first. It felt like a cop-out, a fancy term for a grief too large for a small boy's heart. He thought, foolishly, that it would pass. But the weeks bled into months, and the silence solidified. It became a wall, thick and impenetrable, locking his son in a world Julian couldn't hack, couldn't buy, and couldn't bully his way into. The boy would shriek, a raw animal sound of pure terror, if anyone so much as brushed his arm. The warm California sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows had to be blocked out with heavy blackout curtains, because the light sent him into a panic. He'd spend hours, entire afternoons, staring at the grain of the hardwood floor, or at a fleck of dust dancing in a single stray sunbeam. Julian Croft had never known powerlessness. He'd orchestrated hostile takeovers, stared down federal regulators, and crushed competitors without losing a night's sleep. None of it, not one single battle, had prepared him for the terrifying vacancy in his own son's eyes. The Croft estate was a monument to modern architecture, a palace of glass and steel, but it felt like a tomb. It was massive, cold, and suffocatingly quiet. The staff tiptoed through the halls, communicating in whispers, their movements carefully choreographed to avoid startling the little ghost who haunted the mansion. 7 nannies, 7 highly qualified, experienced caretakers, had come and gone in 30 days. They arrived with bright smiles and bags of therapeutic toys, and they left, sometimes in tears, either burnt out from the sheer emotional toll, overwhelmed by the lack of progress, or fired in a blaze of Julian's impotent rage. He had a volatile temper when it came to his son, a fury born of sheer terror. He couldn't stand the sound of Leo's tortured screams. He couldn't bear watching the boy recoil from every offered hand, every gentle voice, as if he were being burned. He'd lash out at the caretakers, his voice booming through the sterile halls, accusing them of not trying hard enough, of giving up. But a dark, sinking part of him knew they weren't the problem. The problem was him. The problem was this house. The problem was a world without Clara in it. With every new specialist who walked away shaking their head, another piece of Julian's soul chipped away. He found himself watching Leo from a distance, hiding behind doorways or observing him on security monitors, afraid to get too close. He feared his very presence was a source of pain for the boy. His son didn't seem to recognize him, not in any meaningful way. And that single devastating thought was the monster that devoured his sleep, night after night. He'd wander the mansion after the staff had gone home, a king lost in his own empty kingdom, searching for something he couldn't name. He'd stand outside Leo's soundproofed door, pressing his ear against the cold wood, listening. But the screaming had stopped months ago. Now there was nothing. No crying, no babbling, no sound at all. It was the crushing weight of that absolute silence that hurt the most, a vacuum where a childhood was supposed to be. He used to torture himself imagining what his son dreamed about. Now he was terrified that behind those closed eyelids there was nothing but the same fear and darkness that ruled his waking hours. Some nights he'd just stand there for hours. Other times he'd retreat to his office, pour a tumbler of scotch that was older than he was, and stare at the ghosts on his digital photo frame. Leo as a newborn, chubby and screaming with life. Clara, her head thrown back in laughter, the sun in her hair. An entire life he could never get back. Where did it go so wrong? The question gnawed at him. Was it the endless business trips? The nights he'd spent coding instead of reading bedtime stories? Did this small, fragile boy somehow blame him for his mother's absence? The questions were a swarm of wasps in his head, and there were no answers. All he had was a mountain of regret, and the ever-present, gut-churning fear that time was running out. The doctors had thrown the entire playbook at him. Behavioral therapy, speech therapy, sensory integration, even experimental drug trials he'd personally funded. Julian paid for it all without a second thought. The top professionals in the country, custom-built sensory rooms, in-home programs tailored to Leo's every need. Nothing worked, not a single damn thing. The therapists would leave with exhausted eyes and hollow platitudes. Progress will be slow. We have to manage our expectations. But Julian Croft wasn't wired for patience. He was a man who built empires on results. What he got was silence. Leo wouldn't engage with the therapists. He ignored the toys, the games, the music. He would either scream at something only he could see or spin in tight circles until he collapsed from dizziness. Julian sat in on one session and had to flee the room, a hot rage building in his chest. He slammed his office door so hard a picture fell off the wall, the sound of shattering glass a perfect echo of his own internal state. He was furious at the therapists, at the world, at God, but most of all, at himself. He couldn't fix his own child. His money was paper. His power was a joke. His connections were meaningless. The one thing he wanted in the entire world, the only thing that mattered, was to hear his son say "Dad" again. Just once. And he couldn't make it happen. The house was modified to Leo's condition. Custom low-spectrum lighting was installed because normal bulbs caused him pain. Soundproofing was added to his wing so his episodes wouldn't reverberate through the house. A therapist suggested visual schedules and picture boards, but Leo had ripped them from the walls in a silent, terrifying rage. Meals were a daily battleground. He wouldn't eat if the textures were wrong, if the colors touched on the plate. Bath time was a two-person ordeal that often ended in screaming and exhaustion for everyone involved. And yet, in the blackest depths of his despair, Julian still hoped. A stubborn, foolish part of him believed that if he just pushed harder, spent more, found the right person, something would finally click. But every day that passed, every time Leo looked through him without a flicker of recognition, another door slammed shut in the echoing hallways of his heart. He'd stopped going into the city. He ran his company through video calls, letting his lieutenants handle the day-to-day. His world, once global, had shrunk to the confines of this beautiful, sterile prison, to a boy lost in the fog, and to the growing, paralyzing fear that his own presence was making everything worse. The breaking point, the moment that finally shattered his carefully constructed facade of control, came on a Tuesday morning. It was early, the fog still clinging to the hills outside. Julian tried something simple, something a normal father would do. He brought Leo a small red toy car, a die-cast model of a Ferrari he himself had loved as a boy. He sat on the floor of Leo's room, a few feet away, and rolled it gently forward. "Look, buddy," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Vroom, vroom." Leo didn't move. His gaze remained fixed on the wall. Julian tried again, making a soft engine noise, a pathetic attempt to bridge the chasm between them. Leo blinked once, a slow, languid motion, but his eyes didn't even flicker toward the car. Then, with no warning, a piercing shriek ripped from the boy's throat. He scrambled backwards, pressing himself into the corner of the room, hands clamped over his ears. Julian recoiled as if struck. The sound hit him like a physical blow. He placed the toy car on the carpet and backed out of the room, his own hands shaking. Later that night, sitting alone in the dark of his office, the scotch doing nothing to numb the pain, he realized he had nothing left to try. What if there was no magic key? What if this was it? A son who didn't know him, and a father who couldn't reach him. That thought was the heaviest of all, a weight that threatened to crush him completely. That one day, Leo might not remember him at all, and the even more terrifying thought. Maybe he never really had. Amelia Vance arrived at the Croft estate before dawn, shown in through a service entrance by a stern-faced head of staff. The mansion was an architectural marvel, a cold cathedral of wealth that made her feel small and insignificant. She took it all in with a practiced neutrality, her face a blank mask. She kept her head down, nodded when spoken to, and asked no questions. Her instructions were clear and simple: cleaning, laundry, general housekeeping. No direct interaction with the child, no personal conversations with Mr. Croft, and absolutely no mention of her past. That suited her just fine. She had been many things in her life: a pediatric nurse, a trusted counselor, a wife, a mother. But here, in this silent palace, she was just the housekeeper. Amelia Vance wasn't the name on her birth certificate, but it was the one she wore now like a suit of armor. She couldn't afford to be recognized. Not after the clinic. Not after the lies. Not after the courtroom that had stolen her daughter, Lily. She just needed a place to disappear. To breathe air that wasn't thick with failure and grief. A place to start again from zero. On her first day, she worked with a quiet efficiency that was almost invisible. She learned the rhythms of the house, the silent signals of the other staff. Most of them spoke in clipped professional tones, a shared language of avoidance. A chef handed her a list of tasks, and she moved through the vast rooms like a shadow. She wiped down acres of glass, dusted shelves filled with books that looked like they'd never been opened, and folded linens that cost more than her car. Around noon, while polishing the enormous grand piano in the main living room, she sensed a presence, a flicker of movement behind the heavy velvet drapes. She didn't turn. She didn't stop her work. She simply kept polishing, her movements slow and rhythmic. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw him. A small boy, Leo, clutching a worn, plush dragon, his small fingers compulsively rubbing the frayed fabric of its wing. He wasn't looking at her, but at her, observing her from the safety of his hiding place. She didn't try to speak. She knew better. Instead, she began to hum. It was a soft, simple tune, a lullaby her grandmother used to sing to her when she was a child, a melody of safety and unconditional love. She wasn't humming for him, not directly. It was for herself, a way to soothe the jagged edges of her own anxiety. But maybe, just maybe, it could be for him too. She didn't look his way, didn't acknowledge him, just kept working as if she were alone, filling the oppressive silence with a gentle, wordless song. The next day was much the same. She cleaned the long, echoing hallways, organized pristine pantries, and mopped floors so polished you could see your reflection in them. She passed Leo once in an upstairs corridor. He was sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, his little legs tucked under him, his gaze fixed on some distant, invisible point. The stuffed dragon was in his lap, a silent guardian. Amelia gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod in his direction, but didn't break her stride. No sudden movements, no loud noises, no expectations. In the kitchen, while she helped the cook with prep work, she noticed a glass of organic, warm milk sitting untouched on the counter. "Is this for Leo?" she asked quietly. The cook sighed, not looking up from his chopping. "He never drinks it, but we offer it, every day." Amelia filed that piece of information away. Later that evening, after her official duties were done, as she did one last wipe of the dining room table, she quietly poured a fresh, small glass of the warm milk. She placed it on the floor in the hallway, near the spot where she had seen him sitting earlier. Then she turned and walked away without a second glance. She made no show of it. It was a silent offering, with no strings attached. By the third day, the air in the house had shifted, a subtle change in the atmospheric pressure that only she seemed to notice. She was sweeping near the kitchen again when she saw Leo sitting just outside the doorway. He wasn't hiding this time. He sat with his back to the wall, his dragon in one hand, and his wide, curious eyes were fixed on her. He didn't seem afraid. He just watched. Amelia's heart gave a little flutter, but her expression remained serene. She kept sweeping, her movements predictable and calm, and she began to hum her grandmother's lullaby. She didn't try to make eye contact or force a smile. She just existed in the space with him, a non-threatening presence. After a few minutes, she poured another small glass of milk and placed it on the floor near him, before moving on to clean another room. When she returned 20 minutes later, the glass was empty. She told no one. She didn't smile or feel a surge of triumph, but deep inside, in the broken part of her soul that she thought had died in that courtroom, she felt a tiny, fragile seed of hope take root. It wasn't a cure, it wasn't a breakthrough, but for a boy who had walled himself off from the entire world, it was a beginning. It was everything. Amelia never deviated from this new, unspoken routine. She stuck to her chores, a silent, steady presence in the chaotic silence of the Croft mansion. She cleaned bathrooms, polished family photos in the hall that made her own heart ache, and folded laundry that still held the faint, clean scent of a little boy. She would see Leo around the house, a small shadow in the vast spaces, always with his dragon. But now, when she passed, his eyes would follow her. Just a glance. But it was a connection, a tiny thread in the darkness. She never pushed for more. She let him set the pace. Every day, she would leave the small glass of milk near wherever she thought he might be. Some days, it remained untouched. On other days, it would be gone. Amelia never changed her routine. She never spoke a single word to him. She just worked, she hummed, and she made sure the milk was always there. A quiet gesture of care, with no demands. That, she knew instinctively, was what this little boy needed. I've got to pause here for a second. Can you even imagine that kind of patience? To offer something every single day, not knowing if it will be accepted with no guarantee of a reward? It's a powerful lesson in love, isn't it? Let me know in the comments what you think of Amelia's approach. And if you're finding value in this story, please consider subscribing. It helps more than you know. Now, let's get back to it. In the evenings, after the house grew still and the day staff had departed, Amelia would sit in the cavernous laundry room, folding the last load of towels. In the quiet hum of the machines, her thoughts would drift back to her old life, to the woman she used to be, to the name Dr. Eleanor Vance. The name still felt like a shard of glass in her heart. Her former sister-in-law, a celebrated child psychologist whose professional jealousy and personal cruelty had cost Amelia everything. Eleanor had twisted a simple mistake at the clinic, a breach of protocol born of compassion, and spun it into a narrative of negligence and instability. She had testified against Amelia in court, her words poisoning the judge, poisoning her ex-husband, and ultimately stealing her daughter, Lily. She hadn't seen her little girl in 2 years. Now here she was, in a house drowning in a different kind of silence, trying to piece together the fragments of her life. She hadn't come here looking for a boy like Leo, but maybe, just maybe, this was a second chance. Not to fix him, not to be his therapist, but just to be someone who didn't walk away, someone who could sit in the silence with him. As she cleaned the kitchen floor that night, she saw the empty milk glass by the door, and for the first time in a very long time, Amelia allowed herself a small, secret smile. That empty glass was a promise. Rain lashed against the panoramic windows of the mansion, a relentless drumming that matched the fatigue in Amelia's bones. The sky over the valley was a bruised purple, and the day had been endless. She'd cleaned, folded, organized, and polished until her muscles screamed in protest. After the evening meal was cleared and the house settled into its nightly hush, she found her way to the main living room. The gas fireplace was off, but the thick, plush rug on the floor beckoned to her. She sat down with a weary sigh, stretching her aching legs, and then slowly lay back, the soft fibers cushioning her head. She let her body go limp, a marionette with its strings cut. She closed her eyes, just for a moment, seeking a brief refuge from the day. The rhythmic sound of the rain was soothing. She wasn't thinking about her chores, or her painful memories, or even about Leo. She was just empty. Her breathing deepened, her thoughts began to drift, and she floated in the peaceful void between wakefulness and sleep. She heard no footsteps, no rustle of clothing. She had no idea she was no longer alone. But then a feather-light touch on her chest. Something soft, careful, a whisper of an object placed with intense concentration. Amelia's eyes fluttered open. She didn't move, didn't even breathe, afraid the slightest motion would shatter the fragile moment. A small plastic toy stethoscope was resting on her chest, the kind from a child's doctor kit, and kneeling over her, his face a mask of solemn focus, was Leo. His small hand held the earpieces, as if he were a world-renowned cardiologist listening for the secrets of her heart. Amelia looked directly into his eyes, and for the very first time, he looked back. There was no fear, no panic, no vacant stare. There was only connection, a clear, unbroken line between them. And then, the miracle. Leo spoke. His voice was a tiny, fragile thing, barely a whisper, but the words were as clear as a bell. "It's okay, Mama," he breathed. "I'll fix it." Amelia's heart stopped. She couldn't speak. She couldn't move. She could barely process the sound. He had called her Mama. He had spoken a full sentence. He had spoken at all. It made no sense, and yet, in the profound, sacred space of that moment, it was the only thing in the world that did. Leo was right there with her, present, engaged, and more alive than anyone had seen him in years. Amelia could only stare, suspended in time, witnessing the impossible unfold before her very eyes. At that exact instant, the door to the living room swung open. Julian Croft stepped inside, his face etched with the usual exhaustion, expecting to find an empty room. Instead, he saw his son, his silent, unreachable son, kneeling beside the housekeeper, holding a toy. Leo didn't even register his father's presence. His entire universe was focused on the woman lying on the floor. Julian froze mid-stride. Words failed him. His eyes locked on Leo, then on Amelia. He saw the toy stethoscope. He saw the intense, calm expression on his son's face. And then he heard it, faint but undeniable. "I'll fix it." The words didn't just register, they detonated in his mind. His son had spoken. After 2 years of soul-crushing silence, Leo had spoken. And the words hadn't been for him. They were for her, for the housekeeper. A tidal wave of conflicting emotions crashed over Julian. Confusion, white-hot jealousy, profound grief, and a bewildering, explosive sense of hope. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. Healing was supposed to come from specialists, from programs, from him. He took an involuntary step back, a stranger in his own home, witnessing a sacred ritual he had no part in. For years, he had thrown millions at the problem. The best therapists, speech pathologists, and behavioral experts in the world had all failed. He had poured his time, his energy, his very soul into trying to find the key to his son's prison. And now, this woman, this stranger, had walked in and, in a matter of days, had done the impossible. She wasn't a doctor. She hadn't followed any of the expensive, useless plans. She just cleaned his goddamn house. And yet, Leo had chosen her. Julian didn't know whether to scream at her or fall at her feet. One part of him felt profoundly betrayed, as if she had stolen something that was rightfully his. Another part of him felt a relief so immense it made his knees weak. He just stood there, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the moment. Amelia didn't speak. She just looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and apprehension. Leo, completely oblivious to the emotional storm raging just a few feet away, gently pressed the toy stethoscope to her chest again. A small boy trying to heal a broken world. Later that night, long after Leo was asleep and the house had once again fallen silent, Julian sat alone in his stark, modern study. The only light came from the city glowing below his window. In front of him on the polished desk was a framed photograph of Clara, her arm around a much younger Leo, both of them beaming with a light that had long since been extinguished. That memory felt like it belonged to another man's life. He stared at the picture, his thoughts a chaotic mess. He wanted to believe this moment was a breakthrough, the beginning of a new chapter. But it was so damn complicated. Why Amelia? Why now? He had tried everything and failed spectacularly, and this quiet, unassuming woman had succeeded without even trying. Julian didn't know what to feel. There was an ache in his chest, a deep, unfamiliar pain. He lowered his head into his hands, and quietly, for the first time since Clara's funeral, he began to cry. Not loud, racking sobs, but slow, silent tears of grief, frustration, and a strange, painful hope. The photo in his hands blurred. He traced Clara's face with his thumb, remembering the effortless way she could calm Leo, her soft singing, the gentle way she would rock him. He remembered thinking he could never be that for his son, and after she was gone, he had proven himself right. Sitting there in the dark, a devastating truth crystallized in his mind. Leo didn't need systems or programs. He didn't need experts or expensive sensory toys. He needed connection. He needed someone who could just be with him, without expectation, without pressure. Someone who saw the boy, not the diagnosis. Amelia had been that person. She had filled a space that Julian, with all his desperate, clumsy efforts, had only made bigger. He wept, not for his failure, but for the staggering realization that for the first time in years, his son might still be in there after all. Maybe. Julian sat in his study late into the night, the cold blue light of his laptop illuminating his grim face as he tore through encrypted databases and private records. His initial curiosity about Amelia had morphed into a gnawing suspicion. A man like Julian Croft didn't believe in miracles. He believed in data. And something about Amelia's sudden, miraculous connection with Leo didn't add up. She had no references, no verifiable history, just a quiet woman who had succeeded where legions of experts had failed. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford, not with his son's fragile state on the line. He unleashed the full force of his resources, hiring private investigators and leveraging backdoors into systems most people didn't know existed. It didn't take long to find what he was afraid of. Amelia Vance was an alias. Her real name was Amelia Gable. Years ago, she was a pediatric nurse. A good one, by all accounts. But her career had ended in a firestorm of scandal. Fired. Investigated. A brutal custody battle followed, and she lost her daughter. The judge's ruling was scathing, citing professional negligence and emotional instability. And the key witness whose testimony had sealed Amelia's fate, the expert who had painted her as a danger to children? Dr. Eleanor Vance, Julian's own highly paid, trusted child behavior consultant, the architect of Leo's entire failed therapeutic program. The revelation hit him like a physical blow. The next morning, Julian summoned Eleanor to his office. She arrived, as always, impeccably dressed, radiating an aura of calm, professional authority. When he brought up Amelia, her expression hardened instantly. "She's a danger, Julian," Eleanor said, her voice sharp and clinical. "I warned you about hiring unvetted staff. I know her history. The woman is unstable. She forms inappropriate attachments and has a history of making reckless, emotional decisions. She is the last person you want around a vulnerable child like Leo." Julian pushed for more, watching her closely. Eleanor laid out a story of how Amelia had ignored protocol at her previous job, how her poor judgment had endangered a child, how she'd had a complete breakdown in court. "She lost her own child, Julian," Eleanor concluded, her voice laced with false sympathy. "That tells you everything you need to know." Julian felt a cold dread creep into his stomach. His mind replayed the scene in the living room. Leo's whispered words, the toy stethoscope, the impossible, beautiful moment of connection. And now this. He had to face Amelia. He found her in the laundry room, calmly folding sheets. He didn't mince words. He laid out what he had found, his voice cold and accusatory. Amelia's face went pale, but her eyes didn't waver. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was quiet, but firm. "Ask Leo if I'm a danger?" The simplicity of her response disarmed him. He stared at her, searching for the monster Eleanor had described, for any sign of deception or instability. He found nothing. There was just a tired, sad woman standing before him. A woman who looked like she had nothing left to hide. A part of him, the part that had seen her with his son, wanted to believe her. Deep down, he already did. But the other part, The ruthless CEO, trained by years of risk assessment and brutal betrayals, heard Eleanor's words echoing in his head. Court documents don't lie. She lost her own child. He felt trapped. He had his advisors, his company's reputation, and most importantly, a profoundly fragile son to protect. If anything happened to Leo under his roof, it would be his failure, his fault. The risk, according to the data, was too high. That night, after hours of agonizing deliberation, he made the call. Amelia had to go. The next day, he found her in the kitchen and delivered the verdict. His words were clipped, devoid of emotion. Your services are no longer required. An NDA and a generous severance package will be delivered to you. Amelia simply nodded once. She didn't argue. She didn't beg. She packed her few belongings in silence and walked toward the back door. As she passed, she saw Leo standing in the hallway, watching her, his small face a question mark. She looked at him, her heart breaking, and gave him a small, sad wave. And then she was gone. That evening, the mansion felt wrong. The silence that returned was not peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating. At dinner, Leo refused to come to the table. He pushed his plate away and curled into a ball in the corner of the dining room. The staff tried to coax him out, but he let out a scream that was more terrible than any Julian had heard before. Julian rushed to his side, trying to speak in a soft voice, but Leo flinched away violently and began to methodically bang his head against the wall, over and over. Julian shouted for help. Nothing worked. Not the emergency medication, not the weighted blankets, nothing. He knelt on the floor, helpless, watching his son self-destruct. Hours passed. Leo's cries didn't stop. His voice grew hoarse, but he kept screaming, thrashing, fighting off any attempt at comfort. Julian paced like a caged animal, calling doctors, demanding answers. One suggested upping his sedative dose. Another recommended physical restraints. It was a nightmare. Every time someone got close, Leo's panic escalated. His small body trembled with a terror Julian couldn't comprehend. Finally, Julian ordered everyone out of the room. He slumped against the door, his head in his hands, listening to the muffled sounds of his son's agony. He had a house full of paid professionals, yet no one knew what to do. For 2 years, they had trusted the experts. For a few short weeks, they had trusted Amelia. And now she was gone, banished because of a file on a computer screen. A sickening realization began to dawn on him. Maybe the reports were manipulated. Maybe her past was more complicated than a court document could convey. But whatever she was or wasn't, here, in this house, in Leo's small, silent world, she had been a source of peace. She had been a source of hope. Julian stayed awake all night, sitting on the floor by Leo's bed, watching his son's fitful, twitching sleep. Dark bruises were already forming on the boy's forehead, where he had repeatedly struck the wall. Julian felt a powerlessness so profound it was almost a physical weight. But beneath it was something sharper: regret. He had trusted paper over instinct. He had listened to warnings instead of watching with his own eyes. None of it had reached his son. Only Amelia had. She didn't come with a fancy degree or a 10-point plan. She had simply been present in the silence, in a way no one else had been able to endure. He finally understood. Trust wasn't built on credentials or background checks. It was felt in quiet moments, in patient offerings, in a shared, unspoken understanding. He thought of her soft humming, of the way Leo had looked at her as if she were the only person in the world. And now she was gone, and Leo's world had shattered because of it. Julian knew then that this was a problem he couldn't fix with money or power. He had to do the hardest thing a man like him could do: admit he was catastrophically wrong. And then, somehow, He had to find a way to bring her back. While dusting the bookshelves in Julian's private study, a place she was normally forbidden from entering, Amelia moved a stack of old children's books. They were worn and faded, the corners soft from countless readings. They were Clara's. As she wiped the shelf, her cloth snagged on something wedged behind the books. It was a dusty, yellowed manila envelope, sealed with old tape. There was no address, just a handwritten label in elegant feminine script. For Leo. See, her breath caught. This was from his mother. It didn't look like something that was meant to be hidden. Her hands trembling slightly, she carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the papers inside. They were medical records, filled with dense clinical jargon, but one phrase leaped out at her. Sensory processing disorder, not classic autism. The report, written by a Dr. Joseph Lang, was a detailed assessment. It described not a socially detached child, but one who was acutely, painfully overwhelmed by sensory input, sounds, lights, textures, touch. It outlined a therapeutic path focused on sensory integration and creating a calm, predictable environment. It was a completely different roadmap. Amelia's eyes scanned to the date. It was from 3 years ago, before Leo had gone completely silent. Her blood ran cold. Why had no one ever mentioned this? Why wasn't this the cornerstone of his treatment? Then she saw a final page stapled to the back. It was a memo detailing a recommended follow-up with Dr. Lang. At the bottom was a small typed note, forwarded to Dr. E. Vance for review. Amelia felt the floor drop out from under her. Eleanor Vance, the same woman who had dismantled her life, destroyed her career, and testified to have her daughter taken away. This wasn't an oversight. This was a deliberate act of suppression. The next morning, Amelia requested a brief private meeting with Leo's current occupational therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Collins. She presented the report, her heart hammering against her ribs. Dr. Collins read the pages in silence, her brow furrowed in concentration. Her expression shifted from curiosity to shock. This makes a shocking amount of sense, she finally murmured, looking up at Amelia. It explains his extreme reactions to sensory stimuli far better than the blanket autism diagnosis. There's overlap, of course, but this is a much closer fit for what we're actually seeing day to day. Amelia let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Dr. Collins promised to add the report to Leo's file and to bring it up directly with Julian. Amelia nodded, but a cold certainty settled in her gut. This wouldn't be that simple. She knew what Eleanor was capable of. If she had buried this truth once, she would fight tooth and nail to keep it buried. But this time, Amelia wasn't fighting for her own life. She was fighting for Leo's. She spent the rest of the day in a silent, determined haze. She went about her duties, but her mind was a whirlwind of strategy. She knew what this report represented. It was a choice that had stolen years from Leo, trapping him in a prison of misunderstanding and ineffective therapy. The screaming, the shutdowns, the isolation. It might have all been different if they had known the truth from the start. This was Eleanor's pattern. She hadn't just made a mistake. She had actively chosen to ignore a truth that contradicted her own preferred methods and diagnosis. She had stolen Amelia's daughter, her career, her reputation. And now, Amelia realized, she had stolen Leo's voice, too. The anger that rose in her wasn't for herself. That part of her had been burned away long ago. This was a cold, righteous fury, a primal need to protect this child, to fight for him in a way no one else had. That night, Amelia sat on the floor by Leo's bed, watching him sleep. He was curled around his plush dragon, his face finally peaceful. She gently brushed a strand of hair from his forehead. "I won't let her hurt you anymore," she whispered into the quiet room. And she meant it. She was no longer just a housekeeper hiding from her past. In this house, she had found a new purpose. She knew that confronting Eleanor was a monumental risk. She could lose this job, this fragile sanctuary she had found. She could lose everything all over again. But she didn't care. If she stayed silent now, she was complicit. Fear had silenced her once before, and it had cost her everything. This time she would speak. She would scream the truth from the rooftops if she had to, even if it cost her the only second chance she might ever get. Because this wasn't just her story anymore. It was Leo's. And he had already lost far too much. She held on to the report that night like a sacred text. She thought of Leo's whispered words. "I'll fix it." It hadn't been a child's game. It was a plea. He had trusted her. He had reached out from his silent world when everyone else had given up. Amelia wasn't going to betray that trust. She thought of every failed therapy, every frustrated expert, every adult who had looked at Leo and seen a problem to be managed instead of a child to be understood. He deserved a champion. The next morning, she would go to Julian. Not just with the report, but with the whole truth. About Eleanor, about the lies, about the devastating consequences. She didn't know if he would believe her, but she had to try. Because Leo had spoken to her when the world said he couldn't. That wasn't an accident, that was proof, and Amelia was ready to go to war for it. Julian didn't tell a soul about the appointment, except Amelia. No assistants, no handlers, and certainly not Eleanor. After finding Amelia's evidence, he had made a call in the dead of night, leaving a terse, desperate message on Dr. Lang's private number. The doctor, long since retired from the bureaucratic world of big city hospitals, returned his call the next morning. His voice was calm, kind, and unsurprised. He now ran a small private practice in a quiet corner of Vermont. "I remember Leo Croft," Dr. Lang said, his voice tinged with a sad resignation. "I often wondered what became of him. I suspected my report was filed away." "We need to know the truth," Julian said, his voice raw. Amelia stood nearby, a silent pillar of support. When Julian hung up, she spoke with a quiet certainty. "I'm coming with you." He simply nodded. He couldn't do this alone. For Leo, she was already the only one who mattered. They left 2 days later, before sunrise. The drive was 6 agonizingly long hours. Amelia had packed a bag with sensory toys, noise-canceling headphones, Leo's favorite snacks, and of course, the worn plush dragon. Julian drove, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Leo sat in the back, silent as usual, watching the world blur past. Halfway there, they stopped at a busy rest stop. Leo had been calm in the car, but the moment they stepped out, something shattered his fragile peace. The sudden roar of a truck's air brakes, the high-pitched whine of a hand dryer from the restroom. It was impossible to know the exact trigger. He collapsed onto the pavement, hands over his ears, a keening wail of pure agony erupting from his small body. People stared. A mother pulled her own child closer. Julian froze, the old, familiar helplessness paralyzing him. He reached for Leo, but stopped, not knowing what to do. Amelia didn't hesitate for a second. She got down on the dirty pavement with him, gently guided him under the relative shelter of a picnic table, and pulled him into her lap. She began to hum her soft, steady lullaby, her body shielding him from the overwhelming world. She didn't speak. She just hummed. Leo sobbed into her shirt, his small body racked with tremors. Slowly, minute by minute, his breathing evened out. His frantic grip on her arms loosened. She just kept humming, a steady anchor in his sensory storm. Julian watched from a few feet away, feeling like an intruder. He had never, ever seen someone calm his son like that, especially not in the chaotic maw of a public place. He felt utterly useless. When Leo was finally calm, Amelia whispered, "We're okay now," and kissed the top of his head. He didn't speak, but he leaned his full weight against her. They stayed under that table until he was ready to move. The rest of the drive was silent, but it was a different kind of silence. A tired, fragile peace. Leo fell asleep with his head in Amelia's lap. Dr. Lang's clinic was a simple, unassuming white building nestled amongst pine trees. It looked more like a cottage than a medical facility. Dr. Lang greeted them at the door. He was older, with kind eyes that seemed to see everything. The consultation room was warm and inviting, with soft lighting, comfortable chairs, and shelves of simple wooden toys. There were no intimidating machines, no sterile white walls. Leo explored the room on his own terms, picking up a block and putting it down. He didn't speak or scream. He just existed. Dr. Lang watched him in silence, his presence calm and unobtrusive. Amelia sat on the floor, giving Leo space but remaining a steady presence. Julian stood by the wall, his arms crossed so tightly his muscles ached. After nearly 30 minutes of quiet observation, Dr. Lang began to ask questions, directing them to Julian and Amelia. He asked about Leo's reactions to food, to clothing textures, to sounds, to touch. After an hour, he closed his notebook. "He does not have severe, classic autism," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "This is a profound sensory and emotional processing disorder, compounded by trauma. With the right environment and consistent emotional support, his prognosis for improvement is significant." Julian sank into a chair, the words washing over him. He gripped his knees, his jaw clenched. All this time, all this pain. The doctor continued, "Your son's brain doesn't filter sensory input correctly. He's not disconnected from the world. He's perpetually overwhelmed by it. That's why trust is his anchor. It's why a calm presence helps, and why structured behavioral therapies that don't account for his sensory reality were doomed to fail." Julian finally found his voice, though it was cracked and broken. "They told me this was it, that he was locked in, permanent." Dr. Lang looked at him with profound empathy. "They were wrong, Mr. Croft, or they didn't care enough to look closer." Julian nodded slowly, his eyes burning. Years of his life, millions of dollars, all spent chasing a ghost, all based on a lie perpetrated by a woman he trusted. Amelia reached over and placed a hand on his arm. "You have a choice now," she said softly. "We have a choice." He looked at her, then at his son, who was now quietly lining up colored blocks on the rug. And for the first time, Julian believed it. On the long drive home, Ethan slept peacefully in the back. Richard drove, his mind replaying every lie, every misstep. He thought of Eleanor, of her cold, clinical pronouncements, of the buried report that could have saved them years of agony. The truth was a bitter pill, but it was also an antidote. It gave him something he hadn't had in years, a clear path forward. They stopped at a quiet diner for dinner. Leo didn't scream. He sat beside Amelia and ate a grilled cheese sandwich, piece by piece. Richard watched him, a quiet miracle unfolding in a roadside booth. That night, back in the silent mansion, Richard didn't retreat to his study. He sat on the floor outside Leo's room and just listened, not for cries of distress, but for the sound of peaceful breathing. And in that gentle, quiet sound, he finally heard hope. The attack was a digital blitzkrieg. Julian woke one morning, opened his tablet, and was met with a barrage of headlines from every major news outlet. Disgraced nanny with violent past hired by tech billionaire. Julian Croft's son in danger? Court documents reveal abuse allegations. Amelia Gable. Who is the woman behind the smile? Attached to the articles was grainy, shaky footage from court archives. It showed Amelia on the worst day of her life, sobbing on the witness stand, shouting in anguish as lawyers twisted her words, being escorted out by bailiffs after the verdict that took her daughter. The articles, quoting an anonymous source close to the family, painted her as a mentally unstable, dangerous predator. Fabricated medical files claiming she had been under psychiatric evaluation were leaked. Julian stared at the screen, a cold, sickening rage building in him. It was a brutal, professional smear campaign. And he knew, with absolute certainty, who was behind it: Eleanor Vance. It was her signature move: destroy the person to discredit the truth. The fallout was immediate. Within hours, Child Protective Services was on the phone. They had received dozens of anonymous tips expressing grave concern for Leo's safety. A formal investigation was launched. Julian fought back, arguing, explaining, but it was useless. The machine was in motion. By law, until the investigation was complete, Amelia had to be removed from the home. 2 solemn officials arrived to escort her out. She didn't fight. She didn't cry. Her eyes found Leo, who was sitting on the floor, hugging his dragon, watching the scene with a terrifyingly blank expression. When the door closed behind Amelia, he didn't move. But as dusk fell, his world imploded. He refused to eat. He sat in one spot, rocking violently. When Julian approached, the boy screamed, a sound of such profound agony it was barely human. He clawed at the door Amelia had exited through, his small nails leaving scratches in the wood. And he cried one word, over and over, until his voice was a raw, shredded whisper. "Mama! Mama! Mama!" Nothing could soothe him. Without Amelia, Leo was regressing at a terrifying speed. He barely slept. He hit his head against the wall. He refused all food and water. Julian sat outside his door, night after night, listening to his son's heart-wrenching cries, a broken man listening to the sound of his greatest failure. He thought of Eleanor's venomous words when she'd called to offer her support. You can't build a life for a child with a broken woman, Julian. But now he knew the truth. Amelia wasn't the one who was broken. She was the one who had started to piece them back together. His mistake wasn't hiring her. It was ever letting her go. Eleanor continued her public assault, giving interviews to sympathetic journalists, praising CPS for their swift intervention. She met with members of Julian's board, spinning a tale of how she was trying to protect Leo from a manipulative, dangerous woman. Julian remained publicly silent. But behind the scenes, he declared war. He put his team of investigators and lawyers to work. He started reaching out to other families, other former staff members of Eleanor Vance. At first, there was fear, hesitation, but Julian was persistent. And slowly, the stories began to trickle out. A mother whose child was misdiagnosed and overmedicated for years. A father who was threatened with legal action for seeking a second opinion. A nurse who was fired for questioning an altered report. A dark pattern emerged. Eleanor Vance ran an empire built on control, intimidation, and the silencing of anyone who questioned her authority. Amelia hadn't just questioned her, she had threatened to expose her. Julian's team found the digital fingerprints. The documents leaked to the press had been expertly forged, but not perfectly. Metadata didn't match. Digital signatures were inconsistent. It was all the proof he needed. This was no longer about clearing Amelia's name. It was about dismantling an empire of lies that had harmed countless children. His legal team warned him it would be a bloody public fight. Eleanor was powerful, connected. "I don't care," Julian said, his voice cold as ice. "She operated under my roof, under my protection. That ends now. I'll burn my own company to the ground if that's what it takes to make sure she never touches another child again." The mansion had become a mausoleum again. Leo barely moved, whispering "Mama" to his dragon. Amelia called once, a brief, worried call, but CPS had issued a no-contact order. "Tell him," she had said, her voice thick with emotion. "Tell him I haven't forgotten him." That night, Julian stood in Leo's room, watching his son sleep, his small face pale, bruises dotting his arms from his own fists. He looked out the window at the city lights, a city he had helped build, and made a vow. Eleanor Vance had taken enough. She had built her career on the silence of children. And now her time was up. He would not stop until every single truth she had buried was dragged, kicking and screaming, into the light. Amelia had fought her battle alone for far too long. Now it was his turn to fight. Amelia sat in the sterile quiet of a temporary apartment, hours away from the mansion, from Leo. The silence was a physical weight. Her hands shook as she scrolled through the old audio files on her phone, a piece of her past she had saved out of a desperate, primal instinct. It was her last resort, a nuclear option she had prayed she would never have to use. It was a voicemail left by Eleanor years ago, on the night after the custody hearing. Amelia pressed play, the cold, sharp voice filling her small room. "You ever speak a word of this to anyone, Amelia, and I will not just ruin you. I will erase you. Do you understand me?" It was short, brutal, and undeniable. It was a direct threat. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she forwarded the audio file to Julian. A moment later she called him. "Play it," was all she said. He listened. And then he listened again. The raw, undisguised menace in Eleanor's voice was the final nail in the coffin. He sent it to his legal team. Their response came in minutes. "This changes everything." Within days, they filed an emergency motion with the court, using the voicemail as evidence of witness tampering, intimidation, and a pattern of malicious behavior. The court, faced with the new evidence and the testimony from other families Julian had found, scheduled an expedited hearing. The courtroom was a media circus. Eleanor sat at the defendant's table, her composure a brittle mask. Amelia sat with her attorney, a quiet figure who no longer looked afraid. One by one, the other families testified, their stories weaving a devastating tapestry of medical fraud and emotional abuse. The nurse who was fired produced emails where Eleanor instructed her to amend a report to better fit a more lucrative diagnosis. Then came the audio recordings. A former colleague had saved years of conversations. The courtroom listened in stunned silence as Eleanor's voice was heard instructing staff to stick to the autism diagnosis. It ensures long-term billing. In another clip, she laughed while saying, "Make them believe it's hopeless. Desperate parents will pay anything." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Eleanor's mask finally cracked. Her lawyers objected, but the evidence was a floodgate that could not be closed. Then, Julian took the stand. He looked directly at the judge. "My son was not a patient to this woman," he said, his voice shaking with restrained fury. "He was a product. His silence was her business model. That ends today." The verdict was swift and decisive. The judge's voice rang through the courtroom. Amelia Gable was fully exonerated of all past allegations. Dr. Eleanor Vance was found guilty of professional misconduct, fraud, and witness intimidation. Her license was revoked, and criminal charges were recommended. Justice, after so many years, had finally been served. Amelia walked out of the courthouse into the bright sunlight and took a deep, clean breath. She didn't feel triumphant, just tired. But she was free, and Leo would be free. Julian emerged a moment later, holding an official court document. It was a letter confirming Amelia was cleared, and could return to his home, effective immediately. He handed it to her, his eyes filled with a gratitude that words could not express. That evening, Amelia stepped back into the Croft mansion. She was barely through the door when a small figure appeared at the top of the grand staircase. Leo. He looked thinner, his eyes wide and haunted. He just stared at her for a beat. And then he ran. He flew down the stairs, his small feet barely touching the steps, and launched himself into her arms, burying his face in her shoulder, his body shaking with sobs. "You came back," he whispered over and over. "You came back." Amelia held him, her own tears falling freely, rocking him gently. Julian stood nearby, watching, his own face wet with tears. Then, for the first time, he stepped forward and wrapped his arms around both of them, pulling them into a hug. It wasn't planned or awkward. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated truth. Three broken people finding their way back to each other. They had survived. The silence was finally, truly over. The Walters Foundation for Ethical Pediatric Care was launched not with a press conference, but with a quiet promise. After the trial, Julian liquidated a significant portion of his tech stocks, funneling the capital into a new mission: to protect children from the predatory practices of people like Eleanor Vance, to provide families with access to honest second opinions, and to fund research into conditions like sensory processing disorder. Amelia became the Foundation's Director of Family Outreach. It was more than a title, it was her calling. She traveled the country, not as an executive, but as a peer, speaking to parents in clinics and community centers, helping them navigate the confusing and often heartbreaking world of pediatric mental health. Her own world was healing too. Months after the trial, her lawyer called. Her daughter Lily, now 9 years old, wanted to see her. The first meeting was in a therapist's office. Lily was quiet, shy, her eyes filled with a child's confusion. She didn't run into Amelia's arms. She just stood there and whispered, "Hi." It was enough. Slowly, carefully, they rebuilt their bridge. They drew pictures, they ate ice cream, they talked about school and friends. Amelia learned that Lily loved astronomy and hated loud noises. She saw so much of herself in this thoughtful, quiet girl. There were years of lost time, a chasm she could never fully cross, but she didn't try to rush it. She just kept showing up, a calm, steady, loving presence. And one afternoon, while looking at pictures of constellations, Lily leaned her head on Amelia's shoulder and, for the first time in years, called her mom. The day Lily came to visit the mansion, Amelia was a nervous wreck. Julian had insisted, wanting to finally connect all the pieces of their new, unconventional family. Leo was watching from the window as the car pulled up. Lily stepped out, clutching a sketchbook. Leo walked over, his toy stethoscope in his hand, the same one from that first, fateful night. He didn't say much. He just held it out to Lily. "You can listen too," he said. That was it. No grand gesture, just a quiet offering of trust from one child to another. Amelia turned away, hiding her tears. In that small, perfect moment, two children who had been hurt by the world found a common language no adult could have taught them. The mansion, once a sterile museum, came alive. The walls were soon covered in crayon drawings and glitter glue. The kitchen was perpetually messy. Leo and Lily were a quiet pair, often existing in a comfortable silence, drawing or building intricate Lego structures side by side. The chaos was beautiful. Julian stopped obsessing over business reports and started learning the names of all of Lily's favorite stars. Laughter echoed in hallways that had once held only silence and grief. They weren't a normal family, but they were a real one, forged in fire and built on a foundation of patience, forgiveness, and the courage to start again. The gala was a glittering affair, a grand ballroom filled with California's elite, all gathered to support the Walters Foundation. Doctors, philanthropists, and parents filled the space, waiting for the keynote speeches. Amelia stood by the stage, her nerves frayed. Tonight was different. The host finished their introduction. And now, a very special guest has a few words to share. A single spotlight hit the side of the stage. Ethan walked out, wearing a small blazer, the toy stethoscope tucked into his pocket like a handkerchief. The room fell silent. He walked to the center of the stage, took a deep breath, and looked directly at Amelia. His voice, amplified by the microphone, was clear and steady. "This is my mom," he said. "She healed me." He paused, then looked out at the silent, captivated audience. "Now we heal others." The room erupted, not in polite applause, but in a wave of raw, emotional sound. People were on their feet, tears streaming down their faces. Amelia stood frozen, her hand over her mouth, her heart feeling like it might burst. She hadn't known what he was going to say. He wasn't finished. He grinned, a wide, beautiful smile. "And," he added, his voice full of mischief, "Daddy helps too." Laughter broke the tension, rolling through the ballroom. Julian, sitting in the front row, dropped his head into his hands, laughing and crying at the same time. He looked up, his eyes meeting Amelia's across the crowded room, and in that shared glance, a universe of understanding passed between them. The next day's headlines weren't about Eleanor Vance or the scandal. They were about the boy who healed. Pictures of Leo on stage, holding Amelia's hand, were everywhere. The story was no longer about the damage that had been done. It was about the hope that came after. Later that night, the mansion was quiet. Julian and Amelia sat on the couch, watching Leo and Lily building a tower of blocks on the floor. "Did that really happen?" Amelia whispered. Julian took her hand. "Yes," he said. "All of it." They watched the children, their heads bent together in concentration. There were no screams, no fear, just the soft click of blocks and the occasional shared giggle. The house was finally, truly peaceful. No one was hiding. No one was broken. No one needed fixing. They had each other. And that was more than enough. It was everything. And that's where we leave them, at the beginning of their new life. What an incredible journey. I am so glad you stayed with us until the very end. Thank you for watching. In the comments below, tell me what part of this story hit you the hardest. Was it Julian's despair, Amelia's quiet strength, or Leo's final triumphant words? I want to hear all of it. Your thoughts and your engagement mean the world to this channel. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that dig deep and make you feel. Until next time.